We're tuning in via Facebook Live. Just a reminder, whether you're here in the audience or watching from home, you can all join in the conversation on Twitter using #YPFP. I'm Alexia Diarco, and I'm the president of Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. I'm delighted to welcome you all here to YPFP's first event of 2018. I also want to extend a very warm thank you to GW's Elliott School for hosting us here tonight, and to everyone in the audience who's affiliated with GW. For those of you who are not familiar with YPFP, we are a global, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that's headquartered here in DC with branches globally. We have about a 20,000 person global community that's growing every day. Our emphasis is on helping amplify voices of young professionals, specifically diverse, next generation, cross-sector young professionals who are helping to energize foreign policy discussions. I don't want to belabor the point, I don't want to be up here too long. One of my first members in DC said that introducers have one job and one job only, and that's to either be fast or to be funny. And since we're talking about a pretty serious topic tonight, and given my classroom joke to laugh rate, I'm not very funny, I will concentrate on being short, I promise. But just one quick pitch for YPFP. Bottom line, if you enjoy this event, please check out our website and think about becoming involved. We have a wide range of programming opportunities. There are some flyers out front where you signed in. You can learn a little bit more. One thing I want to highlight that I think will be of particular interest to the audience in this room is our fellowship program, which is currently accepting applications through the end of January. In fact, our moderator tonight, Jacqueline Sutherland, is one of our class of 2017 fellows. It's a great program that enables people to publish for an 8-month period. They work hand in hand with our YPFP editors to publish a wide variety of writings across a wide variety of media outlets. You also have opportunities to engage in special professional development opportunities, such as this one that Jacqueline is doing right now. So please check out the website and apply. We have a range of thematic and regional topics available for 2018. So back to that promise about being fast, I will do that. I think that our two guests tonight require very little by way of introduction. We're delighted to have Mr. Eric Prince and Dr. Sean McFate with us tonight. Both have served in the U.S. military, and both have been at the center of the private security contracting universe. They bring with them a wealth of expertise, and they're here tonight to share their expertise and thoughts with us. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming all of our guests tonight, and I think we'll have a very engaging conversation on the roles, responsibilities, and the future of private security companies. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Alexia. I want to welcome everyone here this evening for what promises to be a very compelling and provocative discussion. It is truly a privilege and a pleasure to be here tonight, sharing the stage with two men who have truly been at the center of the debate surrounding the proper use of PSCs, or private security companies, in global conflict. While PSCs play a significant role in global security, with many arguing that they essentially serve as an extension of the nation-state's foreign policy objectives, there is very little international consensus on the proper regulatory mechanisms or how to address issues ranging from the very complex moral, legal, and ethical issues emanating from their operations. Tonight, we're going to dive into these complex issues. Look at the use of PSCs in war zones such as Afghanistan and humanitarian crises such as Hurricane Katrina, and ask Sean and Eric's prognosis for how PSCs should and could be used in the future. Finally, we're going to open up the floor and give you the chance to ask the tough questions with audience Q&A. Let's begin. So, gentlemen, not only have you both previously served in the military, Eric, you are a former Navy SEAL, and Sean, you are an Army veteran, but you both have extensive experience on the front lines of PSCs. So given this dual hat you both wear, can you describe at their most basic function, what do PSCs do? What are their roles and responsibilities, who are their personnel, and where do they operate? Sean, let's begin with you.
Well, when we talk about PSCs today, we generally think of an American phenomenon, and that was true 10 years ago. Now the industry is really diversified as a global phenomenon. I was involved in the industry directly in the early 2000s, not working in Iraq, but working in places like Africa. And they do all sorts of things. They do logistics, of course, and some would say they're not really private security companies. They do things that traditionally would have been assigned to a military intelligence. I was doing things in Africa that would traditionally have been Special Operations Forces or CIA. And that's sort of one of the things that got me thinking, is like, is this a smart thing to do? I ended up leaving that world to think about it in different ways as a scholar. But I think people will be surprised who's hiring them. It's not just governments, it's multinational corporations, perhaps NGOs, random billionaires. And the question we should all be asking is, how does this change warfare? Is it necessarily bad? Is it necessarily good? And what will the future hold for us? Because the future of war and conflict will not look like the 20th century if this trend continues.
Thank you.
I would say it goes back to predating the United States. If you look at how America was founded, they were private companies. Massachusetts Bay, Jamestown, Plymouth colonies were companies that were listed on the London Stock Exchange. They hired a private military contractor like Miles Standish or John Smith, who came and protected that first endeavor. And they were there to mine gold, grow tobacco, or build a colony. Across the street from the White House, you have Lafayette Park, the statues of Lafayette, Rochambeau, and Steuben Kosciuszko. Foreigners, military contractors that came to build the Continental Army that fought side by side with the Patriots and won the War of Independence. So this is not a new thing. This is not an invention of this century even. This goes back to far before the United States was even conceptualized. It is as old as warfare itself, and it will be around for as long as men pick up stones and hurl them at each other.
So you mentioned that this is nothing new, that PSCs have been along for a very long time, and it's also nothing new and nothing unique to the United States. So I'm very interested in hearing both your thoughts on the differences between how PSCs are used by the U.S. government versus foreign governments, and particularly with regards to the employees. So are there any policies in place to regulate or prevent contractors that have worked for a U.S.-backed PSC from then joining a Chinese or a Russian-backed PSC, for example?
So I would like to start building on what Eric has just said. Most of military history is private military history. The last 150 years, we've had a collective amnesia about that. The mercenaries have been used in the Bible, up to the Middle Ages, Rome, you name it, and without stigma. But it changed warfare. And what's happening now today is it's changing warfare again. To your point about this, about the future, is that America sort of helped catapult this industry in the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan, turning it from $100 million to a multi-billion-dollar industry. And what's happened is this, is that when the U.S. sort of pulled out of those conflicts, a lot of those contractors went elsewhere looking for work, right? And that's diversified the industry. So now we're seeing mercenaries, contractors working in Nigeria, in Yemen, in Iraq, and Syria, in both sides of the conflict in Ukraine. This is not just a U.S.-only thing. It's used by other governments, like Putin in Nigeria and others. And it's also used by private wealthy individuals, by oligarchs in Ukraine. So who are those people? We don't really know. We don't know. In Nigeria 2 years ago, after 6 years of trying to do a Boko Haram, the Nigerian military couldn't do it. They secretly hired mercenaries to assist the military, and they cleared them out within weeks. Within weeks. Didn't solve the problem, they just pushed them into their neighbor's backyard. It was a favorite strategy. We don't really know who those people are, and this is the big question mark.
Clearly there's regulations about U.S. citizens, any activity they do, any military service provided to outside the United States is regulated back through the State Department and the DoD. When you look at the spectrum of activities, that can range from offensive cyber hacking, which is certainly advanced and developed and evolves to where the U.S. government is not capable of keeping up partly with its own defenses on that, let alone regulating people conducting offensive cyber activity. So just like there is a full spectrum of conflict, if there is a demand signal in the marketplace, someone will fill that. And, you know, when you look at the very successful hybrid war that Putin conducted in seizing eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, and the Crimea, effectively, after having an all-draft Russian army for years, which was underpaid and not very well trained and cared for, he went back to having a professional military, like the United States does. And then he actually, as part of that effort, they called them the Little Green Men, were made to resign from the Russian forces and went to eastern Ukraine, and conducted those operations on behalf of Russia. Only about 500 guys, a few helicopters, managed to seize half the country. So it's a clear example of what a few picked men, specially trained and equipped, can accomplish. And you look back throughout history, whether it's Alexander the Great scaling the walls of a fortress in eastern Afghanistan to all through the wars in Europe and the Middle East. People that have the willpower, the knowledge, and the skill set to accomplish these things. And if there's, like I said, if there's a demand signal, there will be a supply.
Just to follow up with you on that, Eric, so with the example of offensive cyber hacking, given that this is a very timely example with what happened with our election, so if there were Americans that had been receiving the tools and the training on offensive cyber hacking, just to go back to my previous question, could these individuals, conceivably, who have been trained by the United States, then go to a Russia-backed PSC and be using those very tools against our system?
I guess that's possible. I'm certainly not a cyber expert, but I would say that most of the effective training in that space is not being done by the U.S. government. That is largely the private sector more than the government.
Okay. So moving on, one of the single greatest critiques about PSCs at the end of the day is that they are a private enterprise. So even though they are seen as being this body that is essentially an extension of U.S. foreign policy or a nation-state's foreign policy, at the end of the day, their main goal is profit. So given this critique, how do PSCs, how are they able to balance mission versus profit? John?
Well, this has been a problem, frankly. Anytime you link profit motive with killing, it does a couple perverse things. I'm not saying that PSCs in Iraq and Afghanistan necessarily did that, but there's a lot of lineage in, say, military history. You look at the Middle Ages in Italy, which was, in northern Italy was the Afghanistan of this day. We think of the Tuscany wine, but no, it was Afghanistan. And you think of Machiavelli, right? He hates mercenaries. That's how wars were fought. And what mercenaries did back then is they started wars for profit, they elongated wars for profit, they flipped sides like it's an eBay of loyalty. They engaged, when they were out of work, they became bandits, and then they engaged in security racketeering, so they became like Tony Soprano. Like they would show up, an army of 5,000 mercenaries would show up to Siena in Italy, like 1400, and say, give us all of your gold, you got one day before we sack you. And so everybody flurries around, they dig up all the gold, they give it to the mercenary army, and the mercenary captain says, thank you, we'll be back next month. You know? And this happened to Siena like dozens of times. It happened to a lot of other city-states too. My concern, that's not where we're coming from with Iraq and Afghanistan, to be clear. The question is, are we going to that world? Because all we're creating, not just the U.S., but now we're generating an international labor pool of paramilitary power. And when anybody can hire a military to do anything they want, do they become a new type of power in world affairs? And the answer is yes. The papacy of the Middle Ages was a superpower that had mercenary armies. And they also had knights and a lot of other things too. So the question I have is, looking over the horizon, is that something we should be aware of? And I think very much so. And part of what we do in U.S. policy can impact that, because others imitate what we do. We would not start that, I don't believe, but others would pick this up and bring it further.
Sure. You mentioned the Vatican and the Swiss Guards there. A mercenary army just passed their more than 500th year of honorable service to the Holy See. Look, any group of men and women that has a motivation and a capability three buckets to draw from. You have nation-state forces, okay? Uniformed forces of a country, generally very high cost, a lot of capability, probably best used in a state-on-state, high-intensity conflict, okay? As was the invasion of Iraq, when they advanced 250 miles in a matter of days and took out Saddam's army. Or you go to the UN. Remember what UN peacekeeping forces are. The UN hires mercenaries, okay? They just get other nation states to send their militaries, but they pay them very well. The UN just doesn't hire very good ones. They're sending nation states with poorly trained, poorly equipped armies, very ill-disciplined, and the conduct of those UN peacekeeping forces shows itself repeatedly. I think today's USA Today just has stories of hundreds, if not thousands, of rapes by UN peacekeepers in the Central African Republic with impunity. And that's not the only place. And so the model of how a UN peacekeeper works, that soldier gets paid about $5 a day, maybe. The country that sent them there is invoicing that person out for about $1,200 to $1,400 a day. The nation state makes money on them sending that soldier there, who they've largely sent there with no training, barely any equipment to stand around, and that is a formula that's repeating itself in dozens of places around the world at the cost of billions of dollars with very little effect. The third bucket is widely called the private sector, and that ranges from camp and logistics support, food service, aviation support, medical, to the more kinetic stuff, whether it's military training, guard service, etc. And so if you throw that entire private option into the private military sector side, like we said before, it is as old as history, and it will continue to be. And just like bad guys can issue a demand signal, so can the good forces. And of course it requires regulation, but you have additional levels of accountability that can be imposed on a private organization far more so than you can on nation states sending, I would say, in many cases, celebrated peacekeeping forces.
So you mentioned regulation. So let's dig into that a little bit deeper. So in terms of the regulatory framework that does govern these PSCs, discuss that a little bit more. I mean, do they operate within the legal parameters of the country their enterprise is based out of, or are they more tied to the laws of the host country in which they are operating?
If it requires some kind of peacekeeping operation, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, CAR, you name it, it's generally a failed state where the government itself barely functions as it is, can't pay its bills, let alone having a court system or any kind of recognizable law enforcement system. So an external form of accountability is certainly necessary, whether that's through a military court system, which you could argue would probably be necessary to police the peacekeepers, and the nation state that's paying, if there is a private option, that nation state's judicial system should be the system in which they're accountable. And I would say to have an effective justice, just like we do in America, we do most of our criminal proceedings as close to the area where the crime is alleged to have occurred, the same should be done there. Trying to do law enforcement and criminal investigation in a civilian court 7,000 to 10,000 miles away from the edge of battle is not as good as having it in the country where it's happened.
John, would you like to respond?
Not to respond, but I would say that international legal frameworks for the outsourcing of firepower is amazingly paltry after a decade and a half of Iraq, Afghanistan, and others as well. I mean, and this country, despite its recriminations about this industry, has yet to produce a workable regulatory framework, which is an interesting question. I think in many ways, the way it's being done now, I mean, Eric would probably comment on this if he wants, is far from perfect. And internationally, there is nothing. International law is moot on this point. There is a definition of mercenaries that goes back to one of the Geneva Protocols in the late 70s that is both so restrictive and so ambiguous that anybody could wiggle out of it. We have sort of self-regulation, like the International Code of Conduct, based in Geneva, where companies and NGOs and governments who hire these firms sign up to like the Human Rights Good Bill of Health, but it's really hard to enforce. And it's sort of firms have to promise to show up and confess sins, or confess, and that's not really regulation, right? And lastly, let's not talk about private security companies like the US might use in Afghanistan. Let's talk about like mercenaries that are going on in Yemen and Nigeria. Who's going to arrest them? Who's going to go into Syria? Are we going to send the UN in there? No, they're not going to do that. Are we going to send the 82nd Airborne Division in there? No, we're not going to do that. So even if you had strong regulation on the books, it would be very difficult to enforce. And I would say maybe even impossible. This is the one commodity, conflict, that you cannot regulate because mercenaries can shoot your law enforcement.
So on that note, you mentioned mercenary, and it occurs to me that mercenaries and private security contractors are almost always seen as synonymous, but they are not necessarily so. And that's got some pretty important repercussions to it. Can you speak to that? What is the distinction between a mercenary and a contractor employed by a PSC?
As I recall, a mercenary is a person hired to fight in a conflict not his own, meaning not from the country of origin. So, for example, an American hired by an American company to work for the State Department in Afghanistan, by definition, not a mercenary. If that person, even if he's a foreigner, serves as attached to a host nation military, also not a mercenary.
This is the type of question that gets PhDs written, right? Endless, it's like Nietzsche for philosophy. Endless things could be said about it. And international law is kind of ambiguous. Scholarship is ambiguous. Policy community is ambiguous. People in the industry are ambiguous. There's all sorts of euphemism in the industry. Journalists who really want to sell copy are easy to say, oh, everything's a mercenary, right? That's wrong. People in the industry, when I was there, were like, no, we're contingency contractors, not the same thing at all. But like, what is a contingency contractor? That's anything, right? So, part of what I try to do in my scholarly writing is try to add some nuance to it, and also divorce some of the stigma away from the term mercenary. It's an interesting history to the stigma as to why do we think mercenaries are always villainous, and why national troops are always saints. And I don't want to go into that right now, but it's interesting to think about. Where did that come from? Since most of history, it was considered fine to hire for warriors, right? So basically the way I treat it is the reasonable person test. If you're a foreign person doing military, you're armed, doing military things in a foreign war for paycheck, that is more or less mercenary. And not everybody who does that doesn't mean they're unideological. I knew a lot of people who in the private security industry, who are Americans, who would never work for Russia or for Iran because America's enemies were their enemies, right? But they were contractors. And I also knew a lot of soldiers who re-enlisted for $90,000 for a re-up bonus. So this distinction between who's clearly a mercenary and who's clearly a saintly soldier, I think it's a little unnuanced. It's a blend. Soldiers have a little mercenary in them, and a lot of mercenaries have a little soldier in them. And just be mindful that we have this artificial stigma about mercenary.
Let me take you back to the early 70s when General Westmoreland, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army, was debating against Milton Friedman in Congress about going to an all-volunteer military. Okay, because at that point it had been a draft. Highly controversial in the Vietnam War. General Westmoreland said, I don't want to lead an army of mercenaries. That's what he calls what we have today, the all-volunteer force. And Milton Friedman, famous economist, response is, well, sir, if you don't want to lead an army of mercenaries, then I don't want to use a mercenary accountant, a mercenary lawyer, or a mercenary butcher. And his point was that if you're not earning a wage for your services voluntarily, you're a slave. Okay, and for the stigma about mercenaries or not, I'd encourage you to think about a unit like the Flying Tigers. Okay, before America's entry into World War II, the Japanese invaded China and were bombing the heck out of their cities with impunity. And the Chinese wanted to do something about that. And so their chief of staff came over here, pleaded with Roosevelt, said, please help me. He couldn't send any soldiers or airmen or anything. So they hired a guy named Claire Chennault, who was a retired Army officer, to put a unit together. And Roosevelt signed a secret executive order, what we would call a presidential finding today, like the intelligence community has. And these soldiers, sailors and airmen, Marines, left their posts, went to work for a private company in Shanghai called Camco, Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, and they bought 100 P-40 Warhawk aircraft originally bound for Britain. They put those aircraft together, and they went to war against Britain, okay, as contractors. Average Army Air Corps pay was around $260 a month. Chennault paid them around $600 a month, and he paid them another $500 for every enemy aircraft they killed. And they did. They had almost a 300 to 1 kill ratio. Winston Churchill himself equated them to the RAF in the Battle of Britain. So, clearly a niche application. America could not be involved yet, but yet they managed to save a lot of Chinese civilians. And you look at how to stabilize wrecked places, failed states. By my math, there's almost 700 million people living in a failed or failing state. That is an enormous amount of human suffering. Are we going to send the 82nd Airborne Division to every one of those? No. Has the UN, who's deployed close to 100,000 peacekeepers in these places, have they done a great job of putting these fires out? No. They're financially incented to not put the fires out because each of those countries continue to make money from the process. The third option, a private option, it may not be perfect. It is fraught with risks, but I would contend that it is still a far better option to put the fires out in these places. And there's 3 examples just in the last 15 years of where it's worked well. Whether it's executive outcomes ending the war in Angola, okay, a long time war, opposition lost the election, they went back to war, executive outcomes built a brigade, embedded professionals with the military of Angola, ended the war. Sierra Leone, a horrible group called the Revolutionary United Front, known for long sleeve and short sleeve, meaning amputating people's limbs, bayoneting babies, burning churches, horrid. They had captured the entire country except for Freetown, Sierra Leone, fueled by illegal diamond trade, okay? Executive Outcomes was hired, 200 men, picking up basically off-the-shelf Sierra Leone military equipment, pacified, defeated that enemy, and within 9 months of them showing up in the country, there was a free election. And of course, all they wanted to do was leave a quick reaction force in the country in case it flared up again. The Clinton State Department forced Executive Outcomes to leave. Within 6 months of them leaving, the RUF had retaken much of the country and were replaced by an 11,000-man UN peacekeeping force at the cost of $1 billion. The EO contract originally was less than $20 million. So, yes, private contractors, mercenaries, yes, there's risks, yes, there's downside. But I would contend of all the places that are on fire and have been on fire for a long time, you owe it to those people to find the best way to put those fires out. And after 16 years, 17 years in Afghanistan, where we've spent as a nation $1 trillion, thousands of our sons and daughters' lives and limbs and health, we have $1 trillion in healthcare costs coming from that conflict yet, not even accounted for. Find a different way to put the fire out.
So Eric, you mentioned several different conflict zones, including Afghanistan, which we're going to get to in one moment. I'm sure that's at least part of the reason this room is so crowded tonight. But going back to all the different conflict zones, so PSCs are usually seen as being employed to a conflict zone and deployed to a conflict zone in order to implement counter-defensive measures. But, you know, in the fog of war, there are so many instances where defensive action can very easily bleed into offensive action if a certain circumstance permits that sort of response. And so what is sort of the regulatory regime monitoring that in instances where civilian contractors do then actually engage in active combat? what are the regulations, what are the consequences? I'm sure you both have very particular views on this.
I do. So I hung up my holsters for academic road, and I'm now a professor of strategy at National Defense University, where I teach field grade officers, colonels, some foreign generals, as well as the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown here. And this idea of offense versus defense in modern war is absurd. Okay? That goes back to linear warfare or World War I, right? Trench warfare or World War II, Battle of the Bulge. Modern battlefield architecture, there is no front or rear line. You can be hit anywhere. This is, guerrillas are invisible, as T.E. Lawrence says. They're like vapor, they disappear, whereas the conventional army is like a potted plant. It's strong but cannot move and very visible. So when you're engaged in a war like that, which, let's face it, is every war practically since 46, the last 70 years, then why are we thinking about offense versus defense? All the laws of war, based on Hague, Geneva, and the Lieberman Code of 1863, it's a different era of warfare. It's Napoleonic warfare. And it's interstate, it's military, it's the military fight of Clausewitz and not of Mao. And we're in an era of Mao and others like him. So I think the first thing we need to do, if we want to think about how the rules of engagement for not just private security, but everybody, we have to first think beyond the antiquated ways of laws of war and think about strategy in an era without, clearly demarcated lines, clearly demarcated enemy uniforms, etc.
Just to push back on that a little bit, I think when it comes to actual employees engaging in defensive versus offensive warfare, if there is or is not a distinction, in terms of people being penalized, I think that does actually have a very real consequence. And Eric, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, given that Blackwater has brought under scandal for employees saying that they, in a defensive countermeasure, were actually firing on Iraqi civilians, when then the court ruled that actually that was offensive action. How do you view that distinction?
Well, here's the thing. After 17 years in Afghanistan, U.S. and to highlight what Sean said about the guerrillas being everywhere, the fact is any embassy person, civilian contractor, or military person, when they land at Kabul airport, have to get in a helicopter to fly 2.5 miles to the U.S. embassy. Okay, that's the level of danger that they still face in Afghanistan. So whether it's offensive or defensive, if we want the description of what happened at Nisour Square, there you had a case where Blackwater was not an operational control of that mission, right? We were a force provider, meaning provide a person with X years of experience, with criminal background check, psych evaluations, physical, mental reaction training for hundreds of hours after the vetting and screening process, and you send them out to do that mission for the State Department, where they set the rules of engagement, they set the routes and the missions and where to go and how to do. And then with intel briefings that come, say one of the continued be on the lookout tags was a white Kia to be the delivery device for a car bomb. And that incident started with another car bomb that actually went off at a venue where a Blackwater team was protecting an AID official, and that team decided to leave because all the Iraqi guards fled. And this other support team was in a traffic circle, blocking the other lanes of traffic to allow for a quick egress. And all the other cars stopped, except that one, white Kia, which didn't stop and kept coming. And when the guards opened fire on it, a firefight ensued, and one of the vehicles was actually a State Department armored vehicle, $500,000 vehicle was disabled because a round, an incoming AK round, skipped off the pavement, severed the radiator hose, the modern electronic engine, no radiator fluid, no engine, and so they're rigging a tow. So a tragic accident turns into a major international incident. Sadly, I think it could have been averted if we had not followed the policy the State Department gave us, and that being cameras. We wanted cameras, the lawyers didn't want cameras. I think cameras, surveillance, transparency takes away the he said, she said aspects of those split-second decisions. And anytime you put qualified people in difficult positions where it is literally a life and death decision, those are best decided and accounted for by a jury of their peers as close to the battle space as possible and not back 1,000 or 10,000 miles away. Because I'll compare that to an incident that happened here in Washington in the fall of 2013 when a woman, driver, mid-30s, got into an altercation outside of a federal building. Federal police officers opened fire on her car, firing dozens of rounds. She fled the scene, drove to another federal building where another firefight ensued. Not firefight. They fired on her dozens more times. She fled a third time, up near the Supreme Court, where she was finally gunned down and killed. And when they finally looked in the back of her car, what did they find? A baby in a car seat. No weapons, no bombs, no guns. There was no be on the lookout for a car that morning for a car bomb. There was no car bombs that gone off, fortunately, in Washington, D.C. that day. But the idea of putting people in a difficult situation because they were federal officers, they were given very much the benefit of the doubt. Because of the stigmatization that had happened against contractors, I would contend that the Blackwater guys did not quite get fair here.
Okay, let's move to Afghanistan. So Eric, you made waves in Washington with your Strategic Economy of Force proposal, which posits sending 5,500 contractors to Afghanistan to embed with the Afghan National Security Forces and appointing a viceroy to oversee the endeavor. So your proposal claims that, among many other objectives, that it will apply crushing pressure on all 20 of the terrorist organizations in Afghanistan and Pakistan, leaving, quote, zero sanctuary for terrorists. So my question to you is, if NATO could not succeed in this endeavor with 140,000 troops 8 years ago, when the Taliban was in retreat, how will civilian contractors be able to not only defeat the Taliban, but also a very strong ISIS affiliate and the 18 other terrorist organizations to which you allude?
Sure, thank you. Remember, after 9/11, I'll give you the comparison quickly. President Bush had his war cabinet at Camp David, okay, 5 days after 9/11. The Pentagon's option to go into Afghanistan that fall was missile strikes, bombing raids, and one Ranger strike in Kandahar. And then they wanted to wait 6 months and invade Afghanistan from Pakistan with 40,000 conventional troops. A complete full-on mechanized unit, but they didn't want to do anything before the Afghan winter. The CIA said, Mr. President, give us the authorities and the money, and we will deliver this. And they provided some arms to the Northern Alliance, with 100 embedded agency officers and special forces guys, and I think there's a movie that comes out exactly recounting that story this week. Backed by air power, and they stomped the hell out of the Taliban in a matter of weeks. Okay, so the Taliban is a force, we're not 12 feet tall. What we've been missing as a country in Afghanistan is we've done the same thing again and again, and expected different results. We send a conventional unit to train and advise, or to actually do the fighting into Afghanistan. And that's when they had 140,000 soldiers there. That was 100,000 U.S. and about 40,000 NATO. But they send those troops for 6 to 8 months. The first couple of months, you're trying to learn an area. The middle few months, they're productive. The last few months, they're making sure everybody goes home. And then they lift the entire unit out, send it home, send another one, new to the area, drop it in, and repeat. We're now in our 30th rotation of that, with no continuity to the Afghans. So the Afghans see a new Yankee show up every 7 or 8 months. And with no continuity, everybody with a different idea how to do it. Second, there's been, with the massive pullback, there's really no mentoring, meaning embedded training and advising at the company level or the platoon level, where the real fighting happens, not in brigade, in corps level facilities, because there's not that big a conflict in Afghanistan. So what I proposed, and remember, you have 15,000 U.S. troops there now, another 4,000 or 5,000 NATO, you have 30,000 contractors in country supporting those 15,000. So taking a step back, there's about 91 battalions in the Afghan army. And let me say that one part of the Afghan army that works well is the Afghan Special Forces, because they are trained and mentored in the same way by the U.S. soft counterparts. Live with, train with, fight with, alongside, okay? So I said, take that model, but use contractors to embed in each of those Afghan battalions, okay? A 36-man mentor team, that's plenty thick for mentoring, but I wanted to have enough so that every time that a battalion is about 600 people, as it's spread into companies of 100 or so, or platoons down to 30, that there'd always be some expats, some professionals that would be with that unit. Doing that, when you provide leadership, intelligence, communications, medical, and logistics expertise to that unit. Training wheels, okay? When you have a country that is 90% illiterate, that they're struggling to make sure there's an accurate payroll, that there's gold soldiers, there's corruption in senior officers. When you have units out there now, where those poor Afghans, right now if you're an Afghan, you are 7 times as likely to die if you get wounded versus an American. That is immoral to me, that we send those guys out there and leave them hanging and let them die. So putting mentors with them to live with, train with, and again, the model of sending a contractor is we can send a guy for 90 days, home for 30 to see his family, back in for 90, home for 30. And we can pay that guy to stay out there for years, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, and he goes back to the same battalion, the same valley, so you know the area, you have that continuity. You know who the bad mullah is, you know who the good tribal chief is, and they know that you're coming back. Okay, so every time across those 91 battalions, there's going to be mentor teams, and that puts them truly on an offensive footing because they have the confidence, they're getting paid on time, fed on time, resupplied, and they're going to get air power. This is the second part of what I recommend. You have to have reliable air power. You have to have some advantage for the home team. And that means basic helicopter lift, some surveillance, medevac, and yes, even helicopter gunships and strike aircraft, flown by contractors. But they're 2-seaters. Professional pilot in one seat, Afghan in the other seat. Afghan maintains the weapons release authority. Contractor, a high time, 15, 20,000 hour night vision goggle qualified pilot out of NATO, flies that airplane, lines it up safely. Afghan makes the decision, not the contractor. So you have mentors in the field, you have air power overhead, just like we did after 9/11 that worked. The third part is governance support. There are 7 core facilities of the Afghan army where all the food, fuel, parts, and supplies come through. You got to get a handle on the gold soldiers and the corruption. You got to have a handle on ammunition resupply and the fuel not being stolen. You have to have those 4 things right, okay? And that's a matter of putting a few guys with clipboards at those facilities and keeping control of it. The other part of that is really quality combat medicine. Men will fight harder if they know someone's going to patch them up when something bad happens. But when your Afghan colleague is laying there dying 10 days after being wounded in the arm and now it's gone septic and he's laying there dying, what motivation do you have to go do your job anymore? Because a lot of Afghans join because there's no other jobs. But when you treat them like crap and they're not getting paid on time and there's no chance of them being helped when they leave the wire and they get attacked, they desert. And that's why the Afghan army deserts at a rate of 2 to 3% per month. That's right, 1/4 to 1/3 of the Afghan army leaves and deserts every year. So your entire force, you have to regenerate 1/3 of it every year just to keep your numbers the same, not to mention whatever experience that we might have had leaves with it. So everything I lay out is exactly the way the East India Company operated for a couple hundred years in India next door. And I'm not saying it's a colonial army in Afghanistan to dominate Afghanistan, but it is a sovereign, under the Afghan government's sovereign control, with their rules of engagement, with those mentors, be they aviators or ground guys, serving as attached to the Afghan army under, like I said, Afghan rules of engagement. That program takes 5,500, maybe 6,000 contractors versus the 30,000 contractors you have now. So I chafe with the notion, people say Eric Burns wants to privatize war. No, we'd like to rationalize it. After the 17th year of war, it is far and away our longest war. It's now about to be our multi-generational war. And the Pentagon plan is largely the same thing they've been doing for the last 17 years, and it's not going to close the deal. What I wanted to offer was a very cheap plan, okay? Less than 20% of what we're spending now. As a country, we are spending more than the entire UK defense budget just in Afghanistan. It's $52 billion. Everything I'm talking about doing, a rationalized contractor force, a few U.S. soft guys remain, about 500, with their support package, and the Afghan support fund, all of that is less than $8 billion versus 52. I think that's a lot more sustainable option than what we're spending, and you know, the Pentagon has a habit of driving prices up. Look, when they've changed the rules of engagement, that's good. They're more aggressive attacking Taliban targets, but they're flying B-52s, a strategic nuclear bomber from Qatar, on a 7-hour mission up, tanker on the way up, to bomb $100 metal bathtubs that the Taliban is processing heroin in, and then flying all the way back. It's a $1 million mission to kill a $100 bathtub bad math.
Thank you. Sean?
It's really hard to argue with Eric's math. Here, Eric and I stand apart a little bit. Certainly, his assessment of Afghanistan, I think most people would agree is, yeah, right.
Actually, I was just, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Secretary Mattis actually agreed with my assessment of Afghanistan. He just disagrees with my policy restrictions.
Okay.
But the essential nature of long-term dwell, continuity, cost-effectiveness, yes.
So, I think most observers think the Afghan mission is what we call FUBAR, right? We know what that means, right? And the obvious course of action would be like, why do we not leave Afghanistan? And certainly President Trump, campaigned on that very strongly, as did, I think, President Obama before he went all in. I mean, this is the bigger question. What's the national interest there? And I know that Eric is not trying to answer that question. You're just sort of taking up the mission, I assume, and saying, how can we do a better job?
I'll get there. I have a long answer, so I'll get there.
Okay, all right, okay. Okay, so the first question is like, what are we doing there? Maybe we should just leave, but let's bracket that for a little bit. When I teach, again, strategy at the National Defense University, and I work with a lot of AFPAC hands, actually, the way you assess a strategy, a military strategy, is based on 3 criteria. The first criterion is it acceptable? Is it acceptable to the American people? And I think some of the blowback from this summer from Eric's op-eds and media appearances was a strong signal, or arguably maybe with liberal media bias or whatever, that this is not acceptable, that we, Americans, despite the traumatization of war in our own history, have a very strong stigma against contractors. I go back to the Hessians of the American Revolutionary War. In fact, it's listed as one of the grievances in the War of Independence. And we could have a discussion like, well, how is it that we have that, but we also have a lot of privatization in our own military history? It's a strange combination, but there it is, okay? The second, so I think that is, we are the anti-colonial power. We don't want to be considered like the British East India Company, which has very negative overtones in South Asia, going back to 1857, Sepoy Mutiny, and other things. Maybe that's just a word choice that can be changed. But it seemed to me like its acceptability it doesn't work there. The second criterion is suitability. And suitability means, is it the right tool for the job? Are contractors the right tool? So for example, we wouldn't consider Department of Defense suitable for development. That's a USAID mission, right? So, DoD could do it, would want to do it, but it's not suitable. So here Eric and I agree, and I think we're in a minority on this. I think contractors have a lot of pros and cons. It's easy to take pot shots at contractors, but they bring a lot of value, innovation, efficiency, new ideas to the table. And we're mistaken if we overlook that. So I think a contractor model makes sense. And of course, not doing this, repeating the same thing again and again and again, whether it's Einstein's definition of sanity or Colonel Paul Land in the Vietnam War. We're guilty of that now. So I do think that makes sense. But where I really disagree is the feasibility, which is the third bin. A strategy has to be feasible. Now I think everything that Eric has suggested makes sense at the tactical level, and it's necessary but insufficient for the objective we're trying to achieve. Special Operations Forces have embedded long-term with Iraqi Special Operations Forces and Afghan Special Operations Forces, and those units have done remarkably better for all the reasons Eric has said. That's absolutely true, okay? But raising an army is more than training and equipping. Training and equipping is the Department of Defense's mentality for security force assistance. And all it does is give you better soldiers who shoot straighter, right? It doesn't take care of problems like human rights vetting. And this is not, Eric didn't address this, but when I did this in Liberia. So earlier, Eric was talking about the RUF and EO and DECVACOMs. A couple years later, I came in there with another private security company, and we raised Liberia's military after Charles Taylor had left. We took the legacy army, which had been, far worse than, essentially a war in many ways much worse than Afghanistan, and a military far more predatory than anything in Afghanistan, even the Taliban, maybe even ISIS. And contractors remade a new military, but it took more than just putting mentors at the company and battalion level, which I agree we have not been doing. How about human rights vetting? We would never put a cop on the street of DC without a background check, but we do it every day in Kabul and in Baghdad. Why do we do that? I don't know. We did this in Liberia. How about corruption? It's institutionalized in Afghanistan. I agree that a smart guy with a clipboard helps, but I'm not sure that's the solution. And I'm not sure where contractors fit into overcoming a culture of endemic corruption in Afghanistan that seems to kibosh whatever the external community does. There's a lot of other issues with, force design, and it's more than just putting soft contractor soldiers at the battalion level. Yes, that's very important. And what the model has been thus far has failed. So let's try something new if we are going to stay in. But I think that we need more than just a tactical, operational approach of better security forces. We also need, Ministry of Interior reform, Minister of Defense reform, we need executive reform, and that starts to look like nation building. And I think we would all agree that has not worked in the past, unless you have like a solution for that too that's different.
So I've been paying attention to Afghanistan longer than most of you. I actually sponsored personally something called the Loya Jirga in 1997 already, trying to get the king then, Zahir Shah, who had been deposed, to go back to Afghanistan to hold a big peace conference to try to make a deal with the Taliban. Sadly, it didn't work. The king lived in Rome, and I think Rome was a little more compelling than Kabul was at that point. But, one of the things Blackwater did is we built an Afghan border police. We had 4 bases. We trained thousands and thousands of those policemen, men and women as well. But I go to the graduations, and they were so proud, because after 10 weeks, it was the first thing they'd ever graduated from. Remember, 80 to 90% of literacy in the country. But for 10 weeks, they saw how life was supposed to be. If you look at pictures of 1970s Kabul, graduating class at Kabul University, women are wearing skirts, beehive hairdos, short sleeves, okay? Much more modern society than the shock and horror they've been under in war and tribalism, really since the last 37 years. But these Afghans that graduated, they saw for the first time, the lights worked in the morning, there was breakfast ready for them, fuel for the vehicles, the instructors knew what they were teaching, ammo for the guns. They saw how it was supposed to work. And my point of putting cheaper, long-term mentoring and a skeletal structure in that military to give them the ability to go on offense, to truly beat down the enemy, to allow for stability and normalcy to start to return. With mentors at each of those units, now you have promotions based on merit, not based on tribe, ethnicity, or how much the guy's paying, right, to advance that position. I don't really care what the senior ranks in the military are. You build this thing from the bottom up, and certainly after 17 years, we could have done this a long ago. But a sustainable element that sets security in the area. The Brits used to say, a functioning workshop is better than a battalion of soldiers. I was just in Afghanistan this last week, and I met with a couple of guys that have successful mining projects. And they talk about the transformative effect that mine has on the area. Because now they're employing hundreds, a few villagers from each area, and the villagers are so supportive they will call it as soon as the Taliban unit rolls in, so that the guards from that mine can come and interdict the Taliban. Not that the Afghan army would, the guards do. They keep peace in the entire area. After 17 years, folks, we don't even have a mining law in Afghanistan. When I talked about the need for a viceroy, that was not a viceroy to rule over Afghanistan like a colony. No, that was one person, a lead federal official, to harness the multi-headed monster that is the U.S. government and all the arms and spending and policy and everything else. So that state couldn't be doing something that was opposed to what CIA versus DOD, AID, and any of the other dozens of agencies. One person that's in charge that sets the rules of engagement, the spending, and is accountable for the conduct there. We've had 17 commanders in 17 years. There's no continuity. No professional sports team changes its coach every year. Yet we managed to do that with a very expensive war where we send our sons and daughters into conflict.
If I can just interject on the note of the viceroy. So looking at how this would work in practical terms, so I understand the aspect of continuity, but in your proposal, if I understand it correctly, you said that not only will Americans be fighting the civilian fighting force, but also potentially Brits, Canadians,
NATO.
South Africans, NATO. Okay. So what would happen if a Brit, for example, were to kill an Afghan civilian while fighting as a contractor under the leadership of the American viceroy? What would be sort of the legal repercussions
Sure.
policy that would then ensue?
As part of their contract signing, they would sign on to accountability under the Uniform Code of Military Justice to be administered. Effectively, you could ask for a JAG cell, similar to how a JAG cell would be in country to handle any malfeasance by a U.S. active duty person. You could have another JAG cell, or the same one, to handle any contracted person that commits an evil act. With a trial to be held in country, although in this case, a bit of a hybrid, because they'd be serving as adjunct in the Afghan army. You'd have some Afghans in the jury, and also some U.S. military in the jury. Decision to be, and I worked through this ad nauseum with a former Pentagon GC. There is a legal structure that this works under, where they can be tried in country, with a sentence to be carried out back in their home record in one of those NATO countries. So there is a clearly defined method of accountability. The Afghan justice system is a little too immature to turn it over wholesale to them, and you never get the talented people to go and subject themselves to an Afghan justice system completely. But using the same uniform code of military justice that the U.S. military uses, administered in country by the same judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, with a mixed jury, is I think an acceptable way. It would be acceptable to the Afghans I talked to, and I think it would be acceptable to the U.S. side as well.
I think that's an interesting idea. It's been floated for about 10 years now. The
So make
question,
it happen.
yeah. So the question is that it's sort of a legal gray area, and maybe that's because it's untested. So what happens if a British national on an American contract in Kandahar kills an Afghan civilian? Is that person tried in Afghanistan, U.S. court in Afghanistan, in the UK, or nowhere? We don't know. And what would a civilian labor lawyer do? Would they shred the case in a second if they're any good, or not? So I just think there's a lot of unknowns about this. And this gets back to a lack of, we just still don't have a solid regulatory framework for this industry writ large. This is just the proverbial tip of an iceberg for larger problems.
I'm not trying to solve the entire legal challenges for the entire international contractor community. My point is, if a person is going to come and work that contract to do a strategic economy of force program in Afghanistan, that is the legal contract they would sign on to.
as much as I would love to dig into this more, we do have to move on. I want to make sure we have time for the last section before we open up the floor. I would love to hear both of your thoughts on the prognosis for the future use of PSCs. So in particular, what regions and also in what industries do you see PSCs growing into over the next 5 to 10 years?
So, I think the future of private warfare is bright. And I don't say that as like I'm an investor, I'm not a pecunious scholar now. Leaving the discussion we just had, well, it's easy in this town to be US-centric, but this industry is actually evolving well beyond the US experience in Afghanistan or Iraq. Others are imitating this model. So we're seeing any sort of conflict market, we're seeing mercenaries, contractors showing up out of nowhere, like the ones in Nigeria, the ones in Yemen. Isn't Yemen like ex-special forces from Latin America? We're seeing Russian mercenaries fighting for the Syrian regime. We're seeing Al-Nusra Front hiring contractors to professionalize their own terrorist militia. I mean, this is becoming a thing. And so where will we see it in the future? Well, we're going to see the extractive industry using it. Because they have to go to places where their assets that are hard. Like if you're a mining company in Katanga, Congo, you're there for 50 years with some costs. You can't get out. And already this is happening, or oil and gas, or telecom. We're going to see, we're already seeing oligarchs in the Ukraine war hiring their own private militias. They may call it presidential militaries, not the same as what Eric was talking about, but I think something like that. We're seeing random billionaires do this for humanitarian purposes. There was once an actress came to a private security company and about 10 years ago and said, can we do an intervention in Darfur, a humanitarian intervention in Darfur, because the UN is manifestly failing. And if we do that, can we goad the international community into a robust peacekeeping mission, right? So we're, 10 years ago, all of these things were unthinkable. 20 years ago, you couldn't talk about them. I think in the near future, we're going to start seeing them. And this is the trajectory of warfare, where supply and demand meet each other, and it changes war because now war is not just Clausewitz, it's Adam Smith meets Clausewitz. And market strategy will enter war, and CEOs know how that works, but 4 stars do not. And that's why we're dangerously unprepared.
That was Mia Farrow when she came to me.
I didn't want to say anything, Eric. I thought you did own that one.
No, and the UN peacekeeping mission needed helicopters. I had helicopters, lots of them, and the UN sadly couldn't get out of their own way and won't die in Darfur. Look, as we see as taxpayers, warfare is really expensive, and I worry way less about the idea of PMCs generating war and doing unilaterally, because everything about it is expensive. Whether it's the people, the equipment, the everything about it. And it's way better to be in business and to be trading, or drilling for oil, or farming, or mining, or whatever. Sadly, I think the construct that we've been stuck in the last 50 years, where, remember, the U.S. military trained and equipped to fight the Soviet Union in the most massive conventional war you could ever conceive, whether it's nuclear triad and hundreds of thousands of troops in Western Europe. But we've been stuck now for the last 20 years, really, fighting insurgencies with all that high cost structure equipment, right? There's been 87 aircraft lost over Afghanistan, 0 to any kind of enemy missiles, right? There's been 25 lost to enemy ground fire, machine guns or RPGs from the ground, but yet we're still fighting it with $100 million F-16s or B-52s from the 1950s as strategic nuclear bombers instead of propeller airplanes. So the Pentagon has mastered a very high cost, very efficient way to do this. And I think the private sector, which can adapt much more quickly and operate inside that decision loop, will have a much greater role to play. And I think the result will be much more brilliant. I sold Blackwater in 2010, and I moved to the Middle East because of Somali piracy. Because at that time, piracy was raging off the coast of Somalia. There was 85 to 90 some ships taken per year and driven back to the coast of Somalia, and the pirate crews would sit on them for 6 months to a year and a half waiting for the ransoms to get paid. And a country in the Gulf, UAE, wanted to do something about that piracy problem because it was even starting to affect their shipping. And so a police force was built up in the north of Somalia in cooperation with the Somali government, and it was about 600 people. The idea being to go after the pirate logistics. Because remember, the pirates would take a ship, they'd take it back, and while they waited, they'd have to pay their guards and feed their guards. So this police force just went after the pirate resupply. And sure enough, it worked. That went active in 2012, and you see the number of piracy attacks plummet to disappear, and it's effectively gone. And that program cost less than what the pirates were taking in ransom per year. It was less than $100 million. And so it's a clear case of a kind of a full-on privatization. The UN fussed and complained and said it was going to be terrible. After a year, they said it was the most effective security operation in the country of Somalia still to this day.
So looking to on the horizon foreign engagements, last weekend we had a very real fake ballistic missile threat in Hawaii, which I think has brought to everyone's attention the very real potential imminent threat of war with North Korea. So if this were to manifest and we were to go to nuclear war with North Korea, would there be a role for private security companies? Should there be a role?
Well, look, they're automatically involved because of all the maintenance provided to Air Force aircraft, to Navy ships, to base support kind of stuff. Just anywhere the U.S. military moves, there is some kind of contractor presence that goes with it. Full stop. Whether it's an armed contractor or whatever, I don't think, I've never advocated for an armed contractor role in a full-on state-on-state war. That remains solely, should be the sole realm of uniformed government forces. Again, like when the U.S. rolled from Kuwait into Baghdad, they have amazing conventional capability. There's not a stop or to be tasked that to take an air defense missile guy that's moving with the U.S. Army. Now you have to make him a policeman. That's a bridge too far, right? So, big conventional state-on-state conflict remains the sole realm of uniformed forces, but at least the training, log support, maintenance stuff has been, and will continue to be contractors.
So I think, first of all, we assume that if there's war between North Korea and America, that it's going to be a conventional war. Why do we assume that? That's an absurd strategic assumption. It's almost up there with when we invade Iraq, the oil will pay for the reconstruction. Second of all, I think contracting is becoming a way of war, not just the United States of America, but other places. And one reason we're seeing it become a way of work is contractors provide a lot of plausible deniability. Just like special operations forces, just like cyber, not like F-22s, not like all these high-cost systems there. And in an information age, plausible deniability is more powerful than firepower, right? So that is why we're going to see more contracting, more soft, more clandestine means. And yes, there's saber rattling, but everybody's thinking about the Cuban Missile Crisis and not about what the future of war might actually be.
Thank you both. I'm going to give you both an opportunity to say any closing remarks before we open up the floor to audience Q&A.
I would say thank you for coming. Thank you for having an open mind and listening. And I would say just think about what I said about the 3 buckets of options for stability operations. Think about the cost and effectiveness of each one. And then think about the ideal goal is a net significant reduction in human suffering. And what is the best vehicle to attain that goal?
I would say that war is increasingly becoming privatized. And the U.S. has been an inadvertent leader in this, and we'll see this trend multiply and diversify. The future of war is not what we think. It's not World War II with better technology, which is what a lot of futurists in this town talk. It's what Lockheed Martin would like to believe. The future war is going to look messy and it's going to dwell in the shadows. And it's going to be highly privatized and highly other things too. I use now fiction as a way to tell this story, to pull back the curtain of what is actually going on in this murky world through novels. And this is like not literature, it's like airport reading, just to be clear. It's like action, but it's based largely on things I've seen done, colleagues in the industry have shared with me that's been fictionalized. It's called Deep Black.
Thank you.
He's writing fiction, and my nonfiction book is outside of his also.
All right, on that note, we are going to open up the floor to some audience Q&A. So I believe we have someone here with a mic or a couple mics. So I just asked that because I anticipated we would have a lot of questions, that you state your name, your affiliation, and then please keep your question brief, and please ensure that there's actually a question attached to it. Okay, we're going to begin right up here in the blue jacket.
Good evening. My name is Henry Huang. I'm a second-year student at the Elliott School. So my question is regarding on the direct action, the actual practice of PMCs in these areas. So many of the missions of the PMCs are in some of the places that have very complicated security issues. It can be really difficult to carry on some of the issues, especially with nowadays the long war of attacks. And after identify these goals, the amount of the force and what kind of forces should be used in order to eliminate these threats are also become to a question. So my question is, what are the things that can be done in order to facing these challenges to properly identify the threat and to properly use the proper amount of the forces to eliminate the threat in nowadays? Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to answer covering all the insurgencies of the world, but, in a case like Somalia, you have Al-Shabaab, okay? And kind of a local ISIS affiliate. You have a country of 11 million people held hostage by 7,000 psychopaths. And really, it's only about 2,500 of the real hardcore Al-Shabaab, and the rest are just hangers-on. They're located largely along two river valleys in the south of Somalia. That a matter of a 500 to 700 man force with a little bit of air power and a little bit of mobility could rapidly pursue them and defeat them. It's not that expensive. In fact, it's less than a fraction. It's a fraction of what the U.S. spends there now in funding for 20,000 African Union peacekeepers. So I think decision makers, policy makers have to wake up to the fact that the current paradigm is not working. Because on top of the 11 million people held hostage, there's 3 million people in Somalia at kind of constant danger of death from drought. Because if you're chased off your land, you can't farm, you can't build dams, you can't do long-term planning. And that's where this whole thing really breaks down. So if you defeat this tiny subset that is preying on the rest of society, the rest of society will come back quickly. I mean, Somalis are inherent business people. They actually control a bunch of the oil and commodities trade all the way into Central Africa from the coasts. They're entrepreneurs, but they can't deal with psychopaths that build truck bombs so large that the last one killed 512 people in one shot in downtown Mogadishu. That's got to be stopped.
In the 1990s, saw a lot of this with groups like Executive Outcomes, a South African group, going out in Sierra Leone or Angola, backing bad guys. There's another group, there's a couple other, Sandland International. Obviously, there's a lot of controversy about them, but they were also very effective. So, international law classes had moral debates about it, which is fine if you're in DC or London or Geneva. Maybe if you're the people who live on the ground, that's not so good. Questions of collateral damage and brutality come up. And the thing I worry about is if war continues to privatize, what happens if there's a bounty system? And then what does that generate, right? I mean, we all think, oh, well, we'll just decap the whole head of Al-Shabaab by putting bounties on people. But, there's identity problems, and there's an apocryphal story in this ancient Chinese city that had a rat problem. And they put a bounty for every rat tail you showed up with, you got, I don't know, $1, I don't know, ancient Chinese currency. And then suddenly they found that the rat population quadrupled because people were breeding rats in their house to sell, right? And that's, you know, if you could, it's a bit of a twisted analogy, but bounty systems create perverse incentive structures, and privatization of work could encourage that too.
Yes, right down there in the scarf.
Okay. I guess. Hi, I'm Zarina Bartholomew, and I work in a local nonprofit that's based, or it specializes in the Middle East and North Africa region. My question is based off of Mr. Prince's explanation with meeting with a mining community in Afghanistan, and I guess it could be open to both. So what would it look like if the community eventually became like self-sufficient, and when you were explaining, you know, they were reporting to their guards about a possible Taliban presence, what would happen if the scenario became that this community somehow became self-sufficient, or there was no longer this element of dependency on this, I guess, the mining company to protect them? And is this more so a scenario of mutual dependence because the community is relying on the mining company to protect them, but also the mining community as well needs the population for employment?
I would say, people that trade together, people that trade goods and services together tend to not trade hot lead. And so as one mining community and one mine pacifies an area, and maybe somewhere else is an oil field, maybe somewhere else is a big farming co-op, that now you've pushed significant enemy presence away far enough that you can have a police force, right? Because if you have an insurgency, which you have with the Taliban, where they can marshal hundreds of people to destroy a base, it makes anybody really quite afraid of putting resources there. But if you beat that insurgency down to where you can have police, it's ultimately police that end those insurgencies and pick off the onesie-twosie of the bad eggs. But any community, whether it's in mining or farming, whatever, they have to trade, right? They're truly not it's not a kibbutz, it's not a completely walled off from the rest of the world community. They have to trade with their neighbors, but at least if they have peace in that area, they can do the long-term planning that farming requires, or that building a mine or building a factory to process whatever it might be. And I would just say, and also about what Executive Outcomes did in Sierra Leone, the best public opinion poll as to whether that was a good idea or not was before, on their way out to do the mission, the people lined the streets and cheered because someone finally was going to defend them. Because the gunfire surrounded the city and they were terrorized because they'd heard the stories of babies being thrown in the air and bayoneted, of people being burned alive in churches and all the rest. And finally someone was going to protect them, and then they had a real victory parade when they came back having done the job. So I don't really care what people sitting in NGOs and think tanks say about the merits of what an EO did in Sierra Leone. It's the people that got saved from being from barbaric activity. Those are the ones that matter.
So if I could add, I mean, I worked a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, like in mineral resource-rich places like the Congo. And while I generally believe in trade, not aid, in my perspective, there is a problem when the strong takes from the weak. And this is what the situation is for much of the eastern Congo, where warlords come in and they just take. Also in places where there's weak rule of law, there's no contract enforcement. Well, how can you be an entrepreneur if you can't enforce a contract, right? And these are the problems that, you know, corruption, how do we combat corruption worldwide? And this is one of the, if you can figure this out, you have a Nobel Prize winner.
Yes, over here in the yellow shirt.
So this is really for Mr. McFay. There are two areas where you were really fuzzy on laws and rules and regulations, and as an attorney, I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on your position there. You made reference to the International Convention Against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries, and found a fairly detailed definition of mercenary to be wanting and lacking, and then you sort of faded to saying, making a comparison of good and bad mercenaries, which is obviously a subjective term and not very useful. You also seem to be on very thin ice and very, you're very indescript about your misgivings about the legal framework that applies to people that go and serve with the forces. And again, as an attorney, and I've studied this, status of forces agreements, UCMJ and MEJA, there's one enormous hole in MEJA which Congress has tried to fix and has failed, but absent that one hole, there is a pretty comprehensive framework for for administering accountability. Granted, there have been some issues with the execution of that, but it hasn't been a fault of the legal framework. Can you elaborate on where you see, you've painted a picture for a lot of students here is that it's the Wild West and there's no rules. I don't know that I agree with you, and if you can illuminate your position for me, I'd appreciate it.
Sure. First of all, I'm not an attorney. I'm an international relations scholar, former contractor. So what I was talking about is more international regulation. So the Geneva, I forget which protocol it is, third or something like that. It lays out a definition of what a mercenary is, and this is after the wars of decolonization in Africa and elsewhere. That is very vague, right? It's not very vague.
Not vague at all.
Okay, well, there are other attorneys who would disagree with that. And more importantly, what's the law enforcement of this? A law is only as good as its enforcement. And so we can talk about a political will problem, but I think it's part baked into the problem. The UN had in 2009 or something a commission on mercenaries, which was vague in itself, although the actual press conference was actually quite sparky. They declared, I think, all private security contractors like Mr. Prince and myself to be mercenaries. But there's been this gap in the last 15 years of why is there, what rationalizes this question mark that people keep on coming back to? If you say that the law is clear, then how come it's not making it out to places like Nisour Square or whatever? I don't know.
It would be my contention that people aren't reading it, but...
Okay, well that's always an explanation in this town, yeah.
We'll bring an attorney on the panel next
Good
round.
point.
No, there's enough lawyers. Shakespeare.
Back there in the green tie.
My name is Moritz Witterath. I'm at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. My question the first part is, as far as I understand it, in unconventional warfare, we have been fighting groups that act under no specific sovereignty of any specific nation, act across borders, and thereby aren't under any legal scrutiny. So by promoting or making the case for PSCs, isn't there also a risk that exactly this problem we have been trying to fight is actually being proliferated because certain PSCs aren't as obedient to US law and human rights standards as others are that work with the US government? And by that we actually proliferate the problem we have been trying to fight. That's the first part of the question. The second part following up on that is we were talking about the lack of legal framework within international relations, as the question beforehand indicated as well. So what, moving forward, would be the plan of action as to establish a legal framework in international relations, which obviously lacks the rule of law in general, or has a certain lack of that. And so what would be the way forward? How would nation states have to work together to establish legal scrutiny and sovereignty over these PSCs.
I think it's an empty argument. It's like what came first, the chicken or the egg. I don't think the Taliban developed because they found the U.S. was using contracted forces somewhere. The Taliban developed because they wanted to impose their very medieval view of the world on the rest of their countrymen. The idea of, PMCs are practitioners. They're not policymakers. They perform to the market demands in support of a policy decision not made by them. And so if NATO wants to have a joint regulation, they can. If the UN wants to do it, I mean, look, I think the UN should focus largely on policing the major sex trafficking and illegal drugs and ivory problem that they have wherever they have UN peacekeepers. The amount of sexual slavery of young girls wherever there's a UN peacekeeping camp is staggering and is disgusting. And anybody that's really concerned about the issue should focus their wrath there and let give the private sector some more leeway to put some of these fires out. Because again, the private sector might not be the perfect option, but I challenge you to find a better one.
So I would say that in the 1990s, there's this huge debate in academic literature about what is globalization doing to the nation state? How is it fracturing sovereignty and all these things? And things like multinational corporations are an example of this. And now we're seeing multinational corporations that are not armed, right? And so to me, it's an extension of that debate. And all the problems and challenges and benefits of that globalized world are now part of this armed conflict. And in terms of what can the international community do, well, international community, we like to think of it as just nation states. That's a very Westphalian perspective. I think we've moved beyond that. The world stage is crowded with NGOs, international organizations that are more than just some of their members, multinational corporations, etc. So this idea that it's up to nation states and international law alone, I think they've ceded that. And I think that, there's about 194 states in the world. We always think about the top 25. When the Fortune 500 shows up to a place like the Gabon in Africa, ExxonMobil is going to have a lot more power than the Gabon, and simply because the Gabon is a state doesn't mean it has, complete authority over what's going to happen to its fate.
Down front, the gray suit.
I can speak loudly. Well, thank you both for being here. All right, here we go. My name is Jake Breach with the Defense Intelligence Agency. My question is about the role of PSCs in intelligence. In an era where PSCs or other private companies can provide timely and accurate intelligence, what is the role and responsibility to their governments? And then what is the relationship between PSCs and national intelligence agencies?
Good question. I would say the speed and innovation and the cover possibilities. And it depends what section of the intelligence field we're talking about. Are we talking about NOCs, non-official cover people, deep penetrations? Because the fact is, the active spying of sending someone an alias around the world is getting tougher and tougher because of biometric passports. So having lots of hiding in plain sight civilians that are there to do business, that are also working for Uncle in their after hours, is, I think, more important than ever. And it allows the speed and innovation required. I mean, to be in the intelligence business, you have to be a wildcatter at heart. You got to be willing to drill and drill and drill and come up empty and to miss and to fail to get the kind of human penetrations. I think the nature of human intelligence, when you look at how quickly the North Koreans have advanced their nuclear program and how totally unawares our intelligence community has been. There's a fantastic interview with the guy from Los Alamos Weapons Lab, who 7 times was invited to go to North Korea. And every time he went, he was astounded at the rate of development. And it totally caught the U.S. intelligence community unawares. Why? because they're totally dependent on looking from overhead and not doing the hard thing, which is human intelligence penetrations. And so I think as a country, we should be wide open to whoever can provide the deepest penetrations in whatever weird place it is, because as a country, as much as we spend, to be caught unawares that a bad guy who killed his own half-brother in an international airport with VX gas now has multiple nuclear weapons, and the ability to get them to the United States should be very troubling for all of us.
So, traditionally, analysis has been outsourced for some time. Who's on Hamilton? The joke is SEIC is CI spelled backwards. Collection has always been a right line, but it seems to be fading, just like military operations have faded over time too. I think where the interesting stuff though is not the public sector, it's in the private sector. There's a lot of private intelligence firms that do really interesting things who never want to work for a government ever. They only want to work for really wealthy clients or Fortune 500, and they're like miniature CIAs. They run networks. They do my favorite, they call shaping operations. They do all sorts of things, and it will surprise you. And you need this. If you're an oil company going to go into negotiations in a place like Somalia, you need to know who's who in the zoo. And also remember, you have a Chinese company who's getting Chinese government support hacking your emails, so they know what you're going to come in with to bid with. So this industry, which again I worked in, it's based in, like the English-speaking world, it's based in DC, London, and New York. It's very potent, and they do some innovative things. Just like I think the private security world has done innovative things. They've done some innovative things, some things that might make people here turn white, but they're often very innovative.
And let me just mirror that. Last year was a bad hurricane season in America, but if you ask the private meteorologists, they weren't surprised at all. They tracked the temperature trends in the North Atlantic, and they nailed it. But who do they work for? Not for the National Weather Service. They work for the oil rigs, and they work for the cruise lines. Two organizations that care about what the weather's going to be. And the idea of intelligence coming from the private sector literally goes back to, back to Washington, but even to Alan Pinkerton. There's a fantastic picture of Abraham Lincoln, Alan Pinkerton, and General McClellan at the Battle of Antietam. Private intelligence on the battlefield.
Okay, we've got time for about 3 more questions. Yes, back there in the white shirt.
My name is Christian Union. I am a grad student at the Elliott School. Thanks all for being here today. So you touched on the issue of multinational corporations and how they can go ahead and hire PhDs and so on. And I was just wondering, we haven't really touched on how that might impact state-to-state relations. So what I'm wondering is, if you could engage in a quick hypothetical. Let's say there's an American mining conglomerate in the DRC. There's a Chinese state-owned conglomerate in the DRC. And they both hire local militias. And those local militias start fighting. At what point does that start to raise issue with U.S.-Chinese relations? Could it get to that point and it gets to the relation?
The only reason they would fight that I can imagine is obviously over some kind of claim. And that is largely going to be settled, not in the field, but in Kinshasa. There's really the only place where there's that kind of combat is warlordism, where there's no company, it's just criminals oppressing locals and forcibly taking their whatever offtake they've done. So I suppose that's possible, but if you look back in history, in the battles between the Dutch East India Company versus the British East India Company, yes, they did do battle over some ports, over some trading access in those places, but those were long before the Dutch or British Navy had the throw weight to get out there. And I think, if you think about your about a 14 or 15 hour flight from anywhere in the world these days, that the world has gotten so much smaller that the chance of that happening is infinitesimally smaller than it used to be.
So I think that one of the concerns that if contractors get involved in a fight, like just say American contractors go to Ukraine for a private donor, maybe for a mega church, who knows? and they get sucked into the fight, can that drag the U.S. into a fight in Ukraine against Russia? And the answer is we don't know. I don't know.
Yes,
In my experience, I cannot see the US government extending itself to somebody contractor. It's never been my experience.
Hi, I actually have a question from social media. You mentioned that this is for both of you, but you mentioned that General Mattis agrees with your diagnosis, Mr. Prince, on the issues in Afghanistan, but he doesn't necessarily agree with all the elements of your plan. To what extent do you think the administration will still consider the plan? Are there elements of it that you would consider adjusting? Ms. Frankly, I'd like to add it to you as well.
Well, here's the thing. U.S. Army Special Forces could do the mentoring job that I've laid out. But the fact is it would take 66% of all the A teams in the active and reserve forces just to do the first rotation. And that means no other Army Special Forces anywhere else in the world. And that's not even enough to do the second rotation, meaning go back in for the next 6 months or the next 6 months after that. So in the Vietnam War, the U.S. Army was much larger. It had more resources. There was a number of Medal of Honor recipients that received those medals for doing the battalion mentor role, attaching to a Vietnamese battalion. The Army is just not that big anymore, and I don't see them ever being able to adapt enough. Now, the U.S. Army is supposedly sending a mentor brigade, which is basically a U.S. Army brigade stripped of all the junior enlisted. It just takes the senior guys. It's about 500 people, and they're sending them to Afghanistan. But the same failed model. They send them for 7 months, and they leave. And they don't go back to the same place. And so they break continuity the same way we've done 30 times already. So I just don't see them ever changing. It almost feels like saying, patient, kill yourself. There's just some things that are not going to happen.
I think that mentorship at the tactical level is important, but it's not sufficient for what we want to achieve. So again, I think that the model of deep in bed, long term, yes, correct. But we have so many other things to do, other parts of that pie, that I think if these are our if our two choices are sort of like contracting at the tactical level or what we're doing right now, let's create a third bit, because I think that neither of those are sustainable.
Okay, we have time for one final question. So who has a really, really good one? Let's see, we're going to go right down here.
Yes.
Pressure's on.
Yeah, okay. Well, my name's Louis Rhodes. I've actually been in the U.S. military for 20-some years, so I'm a little bit jaded on the contracting thing. I want to get back to what Sean's touched on at the end of the open presentation when he talked about the issue of plausible deniability. And I guess as a freedom-loving American who likes open and transparent government, that's probably my biggest concern when I look at this. I mean, when we look at the hue and cry that happened when Congress and the American people found out that we had Army Special Forces in Africa, then that was U.S. Army personnel. And I'll tell you this, and imagine if we go back to the Flying Tigers. Pappy Boyington is one of my all-time favorite historical characters. That was the president signing a check without anybody's authority.
No, Chinese paid for that.
Well, I mean, allowing U.S. trained servicemen to leave their contract, deploy over there with U.S. aircraft. Imagine the hue and cry if that happened today. So my concern is, and Sean, I think you'd explore more on, and Eric, you can counter him. Where do we see the trap holes of, yes, it makes logistical sense, yes, it makes logical sense. When we start divorcing ourselves from the rule of law and governance and open transparency, where do we see those pitfalls and where do we see those problems coming?
So this is a really dense question, and I will try to answer as concisely as possible. So contracting has a lot of pros, but also has a lot of cons. One of the cons, in my opinion, is it circumvents democratic accountability in armed forces. All right. We could argue like, it happens in the Congress, but I don't think so. Contractors report to the executive branch. They can be used for all sorts of reasons. If they screw up, the government can try to wash their hands of it. Look, contracting is used all the time because it wasn't just George W. Bush who used them. It's also the Obama administration that used them. We have contractors in Afghanistan, like 75% of our force is like contract, or people, a lot of them are not armed, but contractors don't count as boots on the ground. They don't contract as dead people. They are sort of invisible, disposable people. And this creates moral hazard in policymaking, because the executive branch has a new tool in the toolkit it can use without public or congressional criticism, or it thinks it does. And this could lead to dark places potentially. So we should all be concerned about this, and it's not just contractors. If you think about what the CIA was doing in the 50s and 60s before the 70s decade of reform, it was all about what happens in the shadows. And one of the things that came out of the Church Commission is that secrets of democracy are not compatible.
As I think about how many people are in Afghanistan, right? If you ask most Americans, I bet you 99% of them would be able to tell you there's 15,000 active duty troops. And 99.9 wouldn't be able to tell you that there's 30,000 contractors. So the fact is, people just don't care. And it's not like the U.S. effort in Afghanistan is a covert action at this point, or largely many of the other places in Africa. The sad thing is the risk aversion that comes from the Pentagon now with such a mentality on force protection that when you had 4 SF guys killed in action from a firefight in Niger against ISIS, what does the word go out from AFRICOM? Don't get in a firefight again. So it immediately causes a pullback. And this is the real challenge of an all-volunteer army. This is why I think we have this endless war in Afghanistan. When you look at the cartoons in Korea, Vietnam, and World War II, they were merciless at generals that didn't perform. They poked, and they laughed, and they reviled them. But that was when you had 10 and 20% or more of the population that served, or was serving, or were connected to. But now you have 0.5% of the population in the military, and maybe another 4 or 5% that has served or that knows someone that serves. And so you have 95% of America with no clue what goes on in the military, and feel no grounds to challenge or call BS on a failing policy. And that is a real challenge. Maybe General Westmoreland was right.
All right, thank you. Well, that concludes this evening's discussion. I want to thank you all for being here and spending your night with us. Also want to thank GW for co-hosting this event and put in a final pitch for Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. If you are not currently a member, if you do not know much about the organization, hopefully you enjoy the evening. We host events like this all the time. We also have discussion groups, language groups. You heard from Alexia about our fellowships that we currently have applications open for. So please check us out. Please join us. On behalf of myself and Young Professionals in Foreign Policy, thank you again. And most of all, thank you very much to Eric Prince and Dr. Sean McFay.